But I do have good news for us since, so this month, Pastor Conity has been the pastor of this church for 21 years. So since he's been here, since he's reached the pastoral age of 21, we will now be able to have real wine in our communion.
Oh, okay.
I'll be telling that joke all month. Here we go. Warner Press Bridges, read along anyway, even though I wrote it. Today we are going to be in the 35th chapter of Jeremiah. And what all is going on here today in the book of Jeremiah? The northern kingdom of Israel was under Assyrian rule. Judah had become a vassal of Babylon after the victory over Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. This is the year we think this is actually happening, is in 605 BC. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, among many other Hebrew nobles, were captive in what would become known as the first of the three Babylon exiles. That's in the first chapter of Daniel. The suffering and humiliation of Judah as a nation was caused by their disobedience to the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham. So that's our setting for the chapter. It says they're ancient Israelites. They are not Israelites. The Rekabites are not Israelites. They were actually a family that is an offshoot related to Moses's in-laws. Okay. So what we're having is we're going to have some foreigners living among the land that God, and in turn Jeremiah, is going to be using as an object lesson to the Israelites who are not maintaining the faith nearly as thoroughly as the Rechabites are.
The Moabites and Midianites.
This is according to Judges 1:16. The Kenites are the ancestors of the Rechabites, who are the Midianite in-laws of Moses. Yes, Midianites. So what we have here in the land is a group of foreigners. The NLT will call them foreigners living among you. The NIV says foreigners residing in your towns. The ESV, sojourners within your gates, or the King James says strangers within thy gates. It's frequently the phrase that you will have referred to people who are not Hebrews, but were still living in the Israeli regions. Most Bible verses, when it comes to foreigners in your land and whatnot, talk about foreigners in the same sentence as with widows and orphans, because they are among the most vulnerable in society at the time and today. How are we called to treat our neighbors? We are to love them as we love ourselves, right? So if I were to look into Leviticus 19:18, it says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against fellow Israelites, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Okay, so that's how we're supposed to treat our fellow Israelites, or our fellow citizens of our own nation. How are we supposed to treat the foreigners? That was Leviticus 19:18. If we push on to verses 33 and 34 of Leviticus 19, it says, do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you love yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. We call that the golden rule. It's applied to citizens. It's applied to foreigners among the Israelites there in the Old Testament, and that is quoted many times in the New Testament, which we'll also be discussing again in a couple of weeks as we get to that. By the way, there in Leviticus 19:34, it says, remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. It's reminding the Israelites, hey, you guys were once foreigners, just like there are foreigners in your land right now. We're going to see this several times. It might get a little exhaustive with that. So how are the vast majority of the Old Testament talks about how we are to care for foreigners, or the Israelis were to care for foreigners, and in turn, we are as well. For example, the Israelis were to leave grapes on the vine and not harvest the edges of their fields so that the poor and foreigners could eat for themselves. This was in Leviticus 19:10 and 23:22 respectively, but there are dozens more verses than that. I'm just giving a couple of examples. I have an exhaustive list if anybody's interested in checking that out after the lesson. But I will say, notice it doesn't tell the Israelis to feed the poor and the foreigners. They are told to leave the poor and foreigners means to feed themselves. That's also something important to keep in mind. And someday we'll discuss conscientiousness with regard to charity and such things as that, and how our fundamental theorem on poverty and homelessness in our country is completely backwards in many ways, and how we can talk about giving and being charitable in a much more conscientious way than we are today. Deuteronomy 10:18 and 19 says, "He ensures that orphans and widows receive justice. He shows love to the foreigners living among you and gives them food and clothing. So you too must show love to foreigners, for you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt," as they are reminded once again. Now, were foreigners just kind of cast to the edges of Israelite society? They were allowed to be included in celebrations, along with the Levites as well. Even though the foreigners, it was difficult for them to acquire land, while the Levites weren't allowed to have land either. So there are verses where the foreigners and the Levites, who were running the temple, in many ways, some of the people on the upper echelons of society, like foreigners, they still weren't allowed to own land, or they weren't supposed to. By Jeremiah's time, they would own land because nobody was bringing any tithes into the temple, or at least during the exile. Then all of the Levites will be going out and buying their own land and farming their own land at that point. But Deuteronomy 26:11 says, afterward, this is after a harvest, "Afterward you may go and celebrate because of all the good things the Lord your God has given you and your household. Remember to include the Levites and the foreigners living among you in the celebration." Many times those foreigners might have helped with the harvest as well. And we'll talk about that in terms of employing foreigners here momentarily. Foreigners were welcome to worship the God of Abraham. They were invited to, as long as they assimilated, as long as they were practicing in accordance with God's instructions. They had to follow the same rules, laws, and customs as the Israelites. Assimilation was very important. And as these admonishments to assimilate were given to the Israelites by God, it was the Israelites' responsibility to enforce those instructions among themselves and foreigners. So, all practices in the worship of the Lord were to be observed exactly the same way between Israelites and foreigners. Numbers 15:14 through 16 tells us, "And if any foreigners visit you or live among you and want to present a special gift as a pleasing aroma to the Lord, they must follow these same procedures," the procedures aforementioned. Verse 15, "Native-born Israelites and foreigners are equal before the Lord and are subject to the same decrees. This is a permanent law for you to be observed from generation to generation. The same instructions and regulations will apply both to you and to the foreigners living among you." A demand for assimilation into that culture if you are going to be practicing, especially in this example with the Passover feast. Foreigners, if you wanted to participate in any of the Passover rituals of the Israelites, guess what you got to do? Exodus 12:48 and 49 says, "If there are foreigners living among you who want to celebrate the Lord's Passover, let all their males be circumcised." If you want to participate, you got to get circumcised. Only then may they celebrate the Passover with you like any native-born Israelite. But no uncircumcised male may ever eat the Passover meal. So you got to be circumcised there. Verse 49 says, this instruction applies to everyone, whether a native-born Israelite or a foreigner living among you. And I just read the NLT. I'm staying mostly in the NLT translation here. When it says, if there are foreigners living among you, I believe the original would say something like, if there is a foreigner, like singular, living among you, well, then all the males must be circumcised, meaning all the males in his house, which you'll find a little bit clearer in other translations. But I don't fault the NLT at all for that translation. I think it's very accurate for a dynamic translation. Right. Numbers 9:14 says, and if foreigners living among you want to celebrate the Passover to the Lord, they must follow these same decrees and regulations. The same laws apply both to native-born Israelites and to the foreigners living among you. Now, again, that's if they wanted to celebrate the Passover, and that would in turn go to other Israelite holidays. However, there were some laws that they did not have a choice if you're about following. If you're going to be a foreigner in Israel, you have to obey the Sabbath. If they would choose to remain in Israelite society, foreigners had to observe the Sabbath. And that's where we have the mention of foreigners in the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20:10. But the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, who were frequently foreigners, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. So they have a place in Israeli society, and they are also to follow and assimilate into the culture as well. In fact, so that verse I just read to you, Exodus 20:10, is the exact same verse, almost word for word, as Deuteronomy 5, verse 14. Deuteronomy adds on verse 15. This is one of the very few differences you'll find in the listing of the Ten Commandments in Exodus versus the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. What do you think verse 15 of Deuteronomy chapter 5 says? It says, remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out with his strong hand and powerful arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to rest on the Sabbath day. Another reminder that, hey, you can empathize with these foreigners because you were once foreigners yourself. Nehemiah 13, 15 through 22 tells of Nehemiah threatening to arrest foreigners for trying to sell merchandise on the Sabbath. This is not an option. If you're going to live in Israeli society, whether you're an Israeli, whether you're in a Hebrew or not, this is one of the laws that you're going to have to follow. Now, why was assimilation so important? Multi-theism in biblical times and today is akin to multiculturalism. We don't think of it this way living in the United States because we are not a theocracy. Our country is not a theocracy. We have the separation of church and state. Granted, even atheists will admit that we are a culturally Christian society. But in biblical times, as in today, multi-theism was akin to multiculturalism. So in those days, Judah, and this is part of the preface that I gave you earlier with the problems that Judah was experiencing, Judah was seeking protection from foreign entities like Egypt and Assyria, knowing that it would be necessary to adopt their pagan gods and worship practices. So if you're saying, oh, I want Assyria or I want Egypt to protect us from Babylon, well, I have to start assimilating to their culture, even if, no, Siri, I'm talking about Assyria. I'm not summoning Siri. There we go. You would have to start assimilating into those cultures by accepting their pagan gods and pagan worship practices. And we see this, and we talked about this with Daniel chapter 3, how Nebuchadnezzar, basically Babylon, watched Assyria and the northern kingdom of Israel and eventually Judea crumble in the absence of a single cultural identity. Nebuchadnezzar attempted to institute a new religion unique to Babylon, in Daniel chapter 3. He's trying to create a god of Babylon. His motives were not merely religious, but also political, seeking to establish and preserve a single unifying cultural identity in a country that had expanded to include a dozen different cultures and all the gods thereof. Foreigners were also included in the preparation of the building of the temple. 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 2. So David gave orders to call together the foreigners living in Israel, and he assigned them the task of preparing finished stone for the building of the temple of God. Solomon would do the same thing in 2 Chronicles 2, 17 and 18. It says, Solomon took a census of all the foreigners in the land of Israel, like the census his father had taken, and he counted 153,600. He assigned 70,000 of them as common laborers, 80,000 as quarry workers in the hill country, and 3,600 as foremen. Now, by virtue of the fact that foreign participation in the building of the temple is chronicled, we can assume that this following law was observed. Deuteronomy 24, 14 and 15, it says, never take advantage of poor and destitute laborers, whether they are fellow Israelites or foreigners living in your towns. You must pay them their wages each day before sunset because they are poor and counting on it. If you don't, get this part, I like this part. If you don't, they might cry out to the Lord against you, and it would be counted against you as sin. So the foreigners can cry out to the Lord Yahweh. That's a small caps Lord. We know it's Yahweh. They could cry out to the Lord Yahweh, and God would hear foreigners in Israel because God loves foreigners as well. Now, there were some exceptions that we can talk about in Leviticus chapter 20, where God makes exceptions for foreigners in the Sabbath year laws. This had two effects. One, it would protect foreigners from loaning to Hebrews and then not getting paid back because it's a Sabbath year. And in turn, it would also protect Hebrews from losing their land, given some of those laws. I'd recommend you go to Leviticus chapter 20 to go further into some of the reasons for those laws. Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 3 says, at the end of every seventh year, you must cancel the debts of everyone who owes you money. This is how it must be done. Everyone must cancel the loans they have made to their fellow Israelites. They must not demand payment from their neighbors or relatives, for the Lord's time of release has arrived. This release from debt, however, applies only to your fellow Israelites, not to the foreigners living among you. And this exception would protect foreigners. Deuteronomy 28, 43, and 44. This is a potential curse that God is threatening. If you don't obey me, this is what's going to happen to you. Deuteronomy 28, 43, and 44. The foreigners living among you will become stronger and stronger, while you become weaker and weaker. They will lend you money, but you will not lend to them. They will be the head, and you will be the tail. Okay, so that's a potential problem with bringing foreigners into the covenant command, especially when it talks about selling them land. If you sell land to a fellow Israelite, to a fellow Hebrew, well, you can get that land back eventually, one way or another, preferably by paying for it. But there are Sabbath years every 7 years where you would get that land back anyway. Now, with regard to judicial fairness for foreigners, nobody could claim ignorance of the law, whether you're a foreigner or an Israelite. Deuteronomy 31, verses 10 through 12. Then Moses gave them this command. At the end of every seventh year, the year of release, during the festival of shelters, you must read this book of instruction to all the people of Israel when they assemble before the Lord your God at the place he chooses. Call them all together, men, women, children, and the foreigners living in your towns, so they may hear this book of instruction and learn to fear the Lord your God and carefully obey all the terms of these instructions. So foreigners are included in that. They'll be reminded of the law of the Lord every 7 years, and you are expected to obey that just as the native Hebrews would. Israelis had an interest in making sure that foreigners had justice in their courts, and by justice that includes judgment, okay, as in to receive a fair verdict, whether that meant a favorable or unfavorable verdict for foreigners and Hebrews alike. As God gave these instructions to the Israelites, they were being given the responsibility of enforcing the law on all inhabitants, including foreigners. Deuteronomy 1:16, and this is a part of Moses' first address. He says, "At that time I instructed the judges, you must hear the cases of your fellow Israelites and the foreigners living among you. Be perfectly fair in your decisions and impartial in your judgments. Hear the cases of those who are poor as well as those who are rich. Don't be afraid of anyone's anger, for the decision you make is God's decision. Bring me any cases that are too difficult for you, and I will handle them." Now, and in Deuteronomy 24:17 and 18, it says, "True justice must be given to foreigners living among you and to orphans, and you must never accept a widow's garment as security for her debt." I like that. There's like a double meaning there, offering justice to foreigners, orphans, and widows, where it says you must never accept a widow's garment as security for her debt. That makes a lot of sense. Don't take her clothes for that. But I also think there's a double meaning to that, meaning don't demand sexual favors from someone who is vulnerable. Don't uncover her nakedness, as it would say in the Old Testament. And then it ends that with verse 18, where it says, what have we heard before? "Always remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from slavery. That is why I have given you this command." To be fair to the foreigners, because my own people, the Israelites, were once foreigners. Malachi chapter 3, verse 5, "At that time I will put you on trial. I am eager to witness against all sorcerers and adulterers and liars. I will speak against those who cheat employees out of their wages, who oppress widows and orphans, or who deprive the foreigners living among you of justice. For these people do not fear me, says the Lord of heaven's armies." Now, with regard to foreign courts or the countries of origins of many of these foreigners, we see that in the Bible as well. It says foreigners in Israel were not allowed to break Israeli laws, nor could they bring in their own laws and courts with any expectation that theirs would supersede Israeli law. Israeli interest in judicial fairness to foreigners is in contrast to other cultures that had no laws or justice for foreigners. Such was the law of the land before Israel occupied Canaanite country. Reverend Stone and I frequently like to reference Genesis 34, the rape of Jacob's daughter Dinah. They were in Canaanite country. There was no law against raping a foreign woman at that time. This is the law that this is the land that the Israelis were settling, the promised land and whatnot, some 400 to 500 years before they would return. And what's happening here is all that her brothers could say when they wanted revenge against Shechem for the rape of their sister was, this is something that should not be done. According to who? There's no law against it. Okay? And there are still cultures to this day that openly allow rape of people who do not share the same religious beliefs. Those are happening today. very much in the Middle East. Like, we can still commit crimes against people who don't believe the same way I do because they are not under the same law as me. This is when I frequently tell you, like, I wouldn't call this an equivalent in any way, but to draw a reference to that with regard to how we as Christians are to judge in Matthew chapter 7, we are also not to accept judgment from people who do not live by the same ethic as we do. But that doesn't mean that we are allowed to commit crimes against people who are not of the same moral ethic. We are still held by that ethic for everybody, whether they adopt that ethic or not. However, in these other cultures, they openly allow rape of people who do not share the same religious beliefs. They allow what are called honor killings of what they consider to be wayward women, and they even allow genital mutilation of little girls, known as female circumcision. And this is a part of a religious rite. They allow the defenestration of individuals claiming queer sexual identities. You know what defenestration is? It's literally to throw someone out of a window. Death by defenestration of a high building or sometimes a roof. Right? And now, while Christians, we don't condone aberrant sexual behavior, we also don't condone the killing of practitioners thereof. We are to love them as well. Okay. Now, we do still exercise judgment on that sin, just like any other sin, but if they don't accept the ethic that we offer them, if they don't accept the salvation and whatnot, if they don't believe, if they choose not to believe what we believe, what are we to do? We're to move on. We're not supposed to harm them in any way. Reverend Stone.
Going back to the incident in Genesis,
Yeah.
where the sister had been raped, even though there was no law in the land against it, God's law was placed in her heart.
Right.
If there's something that is innate within us that we simply know right from wrong.
Right.
And even though if there's not a law, we just know that that's wrong. You know.
Right. Hence, that's why the brothers knew this is something that should never be done.
Yeah.
Right? Because they were moral agents designed in the image of God. So they understood that. We've discussed that extensively. So, and by the way, we've also discussed extensively in Romans 8 through 11 how God uses the Gentiles. He uses those foreigners. He uses those filthy Gentiles like us to also minister to the Jews. I'll tell you about the Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 21. This is what God says he's going to do, and this is what he does with the Rekabites that we're about to learn about in Jeremiah chapter 35. Deuteronomy 32:21. They have roused my jealousy by worshiping things that are not God. They have provoked my anger with their useless idols. Now I will arouse their jealousy through people who are not even a people. I will provoke their anger through the foolish Gentiles. So now, while the Rekabites were very much a part of the covenant community of Israel, they still didn't own land. They didn't even build houses. They didn't have crops. We're going to talk about that as we go. Here in Judges 1:16, it says, when the tribe of Judah left Jericho, the city of palms, the Kenites, the ancestors of the Rekabites, who were descendants of Moses' father-in-law, traveled with them into the wilderness of Judah. They settled among the people there near the town of Arad in the Negev. The Negev is in basically the southern part of southwestish part of Israel that was considered to be Egypt at the time. All right, so that is the preface I have here on exactly who the Rekabites are and the fact that they are not actually Hebrews, but they're still living in the covenant community of the Israelis and whatnot. And now God is about to use them to shame his own Hebrew people who have abandoned him in so many ways. So, having said that, our subject scripture is Jeremiah 35, verses 1 through 11, though we will go through the entire chapter. I think we can do it. And having said that, would anybody like to go ahead and start with verses 1 through 11, reading a version of your choosing? If nobody else does, I will. I'll mostly be talking out of the New Living Translation, though. Here is Jeremiah chapter 35, verses 1 through 11. This is the message the Lord gave Jeremiah when Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, was king of Judah. Go to the settlement where the families of the Rekabites live and invite them to the Lord's temple. Take them into one of the inner rooms and offer them some wine. So I went to see Jazaniah, son of Jeremiah, and grandson of Habazaniah, and all his brothers and sons, representing all the Rekabite families. I took them to the temple, and we went into the room assigned to the sons of Hanan, son of Igdaliah, a man of God. This room was located next to the one used by the temple officials, directly above the room of Maaseiah, son of Shallum, the temple gatekeeper. I set cups and jugs of wine before them and invited them to have a drink, but they refused. No, they said, we don't drink wine because of our ancestor Jehonadab, son of Rechab, gave us this command: you and your descendants must never drink wine, and do not build houses or plant crops or vineyards, but always live in tents. If you follow these commands, you will live long, good lives in the land. So we have obeyed him in all these things. We have never had a drink of wine to this day, nor have our wives, our sons, or our daughters. We haven't built houses or owned vineyards or farms or planted crops. We have lived in tents and have fully obeyed all the commands of Jehonadab, our ancestor. But when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon attacked this country, we were afraid of the Babylonian and Syrian armies, so we decided to move to Jerusalem. That is why we are here.
This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord during the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah.
Go ahead and read the second verse for us, too.
Go to the
Rekabite.
Is it, huh?
Rekabite.
Rekabite.
Mm-hmm.
Go to the Rekabite family and invite them to come to one of the side rooms of the house of the Lord and give them wine to drink.
Here's part of the commentary. Some may be surprised to find the Rekabites were not actually Hebrew. Their ancestry can be traced back to Moses' Midianite in-laws, Judges 1:16. Although they were not Hebrew by lineage, the Rekabites' devotion to the God of Abraham showed they had clearly converted and assimilated to the point of wide acceptance in Hebrew culture. Their ability and willingness to assimilate makes them a good example to all strangers in foreign nations, whether they are just visiting or seek to find a new home. And then I added a bit of personal advice with regard to people who are traveling to foreign lands. It says, my favorite personal advice to travelers is to learn a bit of the language and make friends with the locals. They'll show you the most interesting things and the best ways to have a good time and whatnot. And so with that, there is, I'll read the commentary that actually did make it through the publisher. For verse 1, Pharaoh Necho changed the name of Eliakim to Jehoiakim before making him king of Judah in 609 BC. This showed Egypt's power over Judah. And those are referenced in 2 Kings 23:34 and 2 Chronicles 36:4. This showed Egypt's power over Judah, which was essentially a vassal state of Egypt. The Egyptians were defeated by Babylon at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. We think that the event we're talking about right now happened in 605 BC. Jehoiakim's rule lasted until 598 BC, when the first of the 3 Babylonian exiles took place. The events of Jeremiah 35 occurred during this time, with regard to them being given wine to drink. First of all, God told him to take him into a pretty prestigious room. So it's evident that Jeremiah had friends in high places for this. With regard to the drinking of wine there in verse 2, it says, the drinking of wine in and of itself is not a sin. As Jesus himself was known to drink wine right up to the Last Supper, the Bible does not universally condemn drinking. However, Scripture does say drinking to excess is a sin, Ephesians 5:18. King Solomon encouraged us to enjoy wine in Ecclesiastes 9:7, but his entire book of Ecclesiastes warns us against attempting to find meaning in life through the pursuit of such pleasures, Ecclesiastes 10:17. We must be leery of those who would say wine in the Bible was not strong enough to cause inebriation. It is true the alcoholic effects of some wines were benign, since it was only fermented enough to keep from spoiling before drinking. This would be useful when traveling and water was scarce. The wine would need to be strong enough to preserve the juice, but weak enough to quench the thirst of those who drank it without making them thirstier. So if you do have experience with alcohol, it does not quench thirst. It only makes you thirstier, but they could ferment wine just enough so that it wouldn't be enough to, children could still drink it and be fine, but it won't spoil. We know wine was frequently fermented enough to give Noah a problem all the way back in Genesis chapter 9. In Genesis 29, 22, and 23, we presume Jacob was so drunk at his wedding feast that he didn't realize he was marrying the wrong girl. And in Acts 2, verse 15, Peter defends his followers from accusations of drunkenness by asserting that people would not usually be drinking so early in the morning at the 3rd hour, or 9 a.m., as we see it today. By this, we can assume wine was strong enough to have an understood place as an alcohol beverage in the culture. It was this culture in which the Rekabites found abstaining from wine to be the most beneficial. All right. Having said that, would somebody please read?
I have a question. Now, is wine
Please,
still like that today?
Wine?
The wine people drink today, is it like that?
The wine you get in the store, no. It usually has about in the United States, it usually has about a 16% alcohol content.
Oh, okay.
No. So, no, that's not that. I'm not aware of any wine you can buy that would just have like a 1 to 3%, which we could, even the somebody who's never drank in their life probably wouldn't notice any effects from 1 to 3% alcohol. But I do have good news for us, since, so this month, Pastor Conaby has been the pastor of this church for 21 years. So since he's been here, since he's reached the pastoral age of 21, we will now be able to have real wine in our communion.
Oh, okay.
I'll be telling that joke all month. Here we go.
Right here is about where
All right. Verse 3, so I went to get Jazaniah, son of Jeremiah, the son of Habazaniah, and his brothers and all his sons, the whole family of the Rekabites. Now, this is not the same Jeremiah, of course. This is a different Jeremiah. The author, Jeremiah, went to see Jazaniah. Jazaniah's father was Jeremiah, also named Jeremiah, and his grandfather was Habazaniah. 4 generations mentioned in one verse shows respect for family tradition. It gives the sense that Jeremiah was speaking to all the Rekabites who had ever lived, as well as all the Rekabites who would ever live. He's speaking to the generations here. Now, with regard to the Hanan in verse 4, I'll read verse 4. I brought them into the house of the Lord, into the room of the sons of Hanan, son of Igdaliah, the man of God. It was next to the room of the officials, which was over that of Messiah, son of Shallum, the doorkeeper. Now, suffice it to say, though we don't know much about this particular Hanan or his father, Igdaliah, we can surmise that a room neighboring that of the temple officials, above that of the son of the temple gatekeeper, was a prestigious location to hold a meeting. Jeremiah had faithful friends in high places, and it's a sign that the Rechabites had been accepted into the covenant community, even though they weren't Hebrews, by virtue of the fact that God told Jeremiah to bring him into this really nice place in the temple. Okay? So in many, many ways, people considered them to be citizens of Israel, if not Hebrews themselves. And I mean that figuratively, because I don't think they thought of citizenship in the same ink and paper way we do today. Verse 5, then I set bowls full of wine and some cups before the Rechabites and said to them, drink some wine. Somebody read verse 6 for me, please.
Verse 6. But they replied, we do not drink wine because of our forefather Jehonadab, son of Rechab, gave us this command. Neither you nor your descendants must ever drink wine. Also, you must never build houses, sow seeds, or plant vineyards. You must never have any of these things, but must always live in tents. Then you will live a long time in the land where you are nomads.
This is regarding verse 6. We know more about Jehonadab than we know about Rechab. Jehonadab, a descendant of Rechab, accompanied Jehu in his campaign to slaughter the worshippers of Baal in 2 Kings 10:15 through 16. His admonishment to his descendants to abstain from wine and pursue a nomadic lifestyle was well known, but not recorded in the Bible. They were also told to live a nomadic way of life, not settling in a specific location. Such a lifestyle was pursued by a lower class, especially given the influence Egypt would have had on Judah's culture. As an agrarian society, Egyptians did not associate with nomadic societies, according to Genesis 43:32. Adopting a nomadic lifestyle would show humility on the part of the Rechabites, who wanted to avoid the trappings of excess comfort. In addition to that, they're also following the laws of the land, because they understand that foreigners are not to own land, or non-Hebrews, non-Israelites are not to own land. Well, they're fine with that. They're going to pursue that nomadic lifestyle and not grow crops and not build houses. Make sense?
Also, the law of obedience. They were, they're not planning, they're not building, buying land, but their obedience, God is making sure that they're taken care of.
Indeed. Reverend Stone, would you go ahead and read verses 7 through 10 for me, please?
Also, you must never build houses, sow seed, or plant vineyards. You must never have any of these things, but must always live in tents. Then you will live a long time in the land where you are nomads. We have obeyed everything our forefather Jonadab, son of Rechab, commanded us. Neither we nor our wives nor our sons and daughters have ever drunk wine, or built houses to live in, or had vineyards, fields, or crops. We have lived in tents and have fully obeyed everything our forefather Jonadab commanded us. But when Nebuchadnezzar...
So the commentary on 8 through 10 says, the tradition that was passed along from Jehonadab down through the generations has continued to the present day. And by that we mean 605. Male and female members of the Rechabite family had always avoided wine and lived in tents.
But when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded this land, we said, come, we must go to Jerusalem to escape the Babylonian and Aramean armies. So we have remained in Jerusalem.
That'd be the Aramean armies for that, is what he's referring to.
That's, is that the book? I left mine. Is that the 12th chapter?
Close, 35.
30, Jeremiah?
Jeremiah 35.
Jeremiah 35.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, and the commentary on that, verse 11, but when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, invaded this land, he said, "Come, we must go to Jerusalem to escape the Babylonian and Aramean armies." So we have remained in Jerusalem. Here's what the commentary on that says. Though Judah was now a vassal of Babylon, the capital would not be under siege until 597 BC. That would be 8 years later. Did moving closer to Jerusalem for security show a lack of faith on the part of the Rekabites? On the contrary, the rest of the chapter uses the Rekabites as a positive example. They were loyal to their ancestors, while the rest of Judah failed to show loyalty to God in verse 15. The Rekabites would be rewarded with a long bloodline that would always serve the Lord, per verse 19. We know that Malchijah, a descendant of the Rekabite family, assisted with the rebuilding of Jerusalem after after the exile in Nehemiah 3:14, continuing the traditions of his fathers through performing both civic and spiritual duties. As promised, we're going to go ahead and finish out the chapter on this. Verses 12 through 14. Then the Lord gave this message to Jeremiah. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says. Go and say to the people in Judah and Jerusalem, come and learn a lesson about how to obey me. So the Rechabites are about to be used as an object lesson to the actual Hebrews who are not obeying God. Verse 14, the Rechabites do not drink wine to this day because their ancestor Jehonadab told them not to. But I have spoken to you again and again, and you refuse to obey me. There's the commentary regarding Jehonadab's admonishment to his descendants not to drink wine. It says this was not even a commandment directly from God, but in the interest of obeying the fifth commandment, they honored their ancestor Jehonadab by obeying his admonishment to abstain from wine and live a nomadic lifestyle. Now that fifth commandment, what's the fifth commandment? That's right, honor thy mother and thy father. That extends to grandparents. That's not just your parents. And now for verses 15 and 16. Time after time, this is God speaking, time after time, I sent you prophets who told you, turn from your wicked ways and start doing things right. Stop worshiping other gods so that you might live in peace here in the land I have given to you and your ancestors. But you would not listen to me or obey me. The descendants of Jehonadab, son of Rechab, have obeyed me, their ancestor, completely. But you refuse to listen to me. So basically, through their obedience to their ancestors, the Rechabites have avoided falling into the sin that captivated the rest of Judah. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and read out the rest of the chapter on this. Therefore, this is what the Lord God of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says. Because you refuse to listen or answer when I call, I will send upon Judah and Jerusalem all the disasters I have threatened. Then Jeremiah turned to the Rechabites and said, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says. You have obeyed your ancestor Jehonadab in every respect, following all his instructions. Therefore, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says. Jehonadab, son of Rechab, will always have descendants who serve me. So, does that actually happen? Absolutely it happens. With regard to the descendants that follow them, Malchijah, who is a descendant of the Rechabite family, he'll be assisting with the rebuilding of Jerusalem after the exile. Chapter 3, verse 14 of Nehemiah, continuing the traditions of his fathers through performing both civic and spiritual duties. So now these foreigners living in the land have been used as an object lesson to shame the Hebrews, the Hebrews who are citizens of this land. We're going to see a very similar story in 2 weeks when we get to the 38th chapter of Jeremiah, in which an Ethiopian eunuch named Ebed-Melech will also save Jeremiah when the officials attempt to put him to death. And that's really a fascinating story, to be honest with you. The remainder of Jeremiah 35 describes some of the trappings the Rekabites avoided by preserving the traditions of their father. The rest of Judah had put their faith in other nations for protection, taking on the pagan practices of these foreign cultures. But the nomadic lifestyle of the Rekabites seemed to make them invulnerable to the trappings of security that comes from others. They had no crops or wealth for foreign entities to seize. They didn't have any land either for foreign entities to seize. They had no houses to burn. And their thinking was never influenced by wine. All of their motivations were shaped by their loyalty to their ancestors and in turn to God.
Yeah. I just want to say that, speaking about alcohol, wine and all of that, coming up myself, and, raised in the Church of God in Christ, they basically were saying, don't drink, period. And then, of course, you hear the arguments back and forth. Well, Jesus turned the water into wine, and, they drunk wine back in, things like that. But I've come to know that even though wine is okay, there's nothing wrong with the wine itself, it is one of the most abused substances. And it could very easily be abused, And the other thing that I noticed is that God has chosen certain people not to drink wine, such as Samson.
He took the Nazarite vow.
Then others have chosen not to drink wine for themselves. Some were instructed not to drink wine at all. Don't even don't play around with it, because you have a high, I want to say, what do I want to say? You have a high responsibility for other people, and you have to keep your judgment sharp and keen, right? So some people have just chosen not to do that. Other people have an allergy. This term is allergy. We're going to, is it sin or sickness, And I've come to know that if you have an allergy to alcohol, it affects your mind. It directly affects your brain. We won't get into that. There's a whole lot of research that's been done on that through neuroscience and all that, and it very definitely rearranges your brain, the neurotransmitters in your brain, which causes the cravings, which is why people who are alcoholics can't stop. They can't. They cannot. They have to have God to help them. And so in choosing, I want to say this: those that can drink, you don't have any DUIs, right? You can do a self-check. If you've been getting DUIs, or you're out there driving and you're over the limit, then it's probably better that you abstain. If it's affecting your job, if it's affecting your demeanor, where you're getting angry or whatever, it's changing your character, and it's affecting your family and your health, and you probably just need to stay away. You need to stop. But others, I've observed, they're able to have a glass of wine with dinner, and that's it. No problem. I say that to say this, that we should not judge either way. Don't judge a person who cannot drink, calling them weak and all of that. No, they're making the right choice for themselves. Don't judge the person who can drink responsibly, let's say, within the limits, and have no problem with it. We're not judging at all.
I would still encourage judgment for people who create problems, though. endangering themselves and
Yes,
others.
absolutely.
You know what I mean? So I would do that.
Absolutely.
And then
Absolutely.
you're referencing Numbers 6:1-14 with regard to the Nazarite vow on that. Brother Roscoe, last word before we go to the apply.
You know, Noah, he was a drunk.
Who?
Noah.
That's what we talked about.
Yeah, but I'm just saying,
Before you
if
got
I
here.
had to do the ark and all those animals too, I think I would need a little something.
And Lot.
Yeah, yeah.
Lot's daughters got him so drunk he didn't know he was sleeping with his daughters.
Right.
Yeah. I made 1,000 references to 1,000 things today in the Old Testament, and I just couldn't be bothered to bring up all the problems alcohol caused in the Old Testament, but I did hit a few before you got here. We're going to see a very similar story in 2 weeks when we get to the 38th chapter of Jeremiah, in which an Ethiopian eunuch named Ebed-Melech will also save Jeremiah when the officials attempt to put him to death. And that's really a fascinating story, to be honest with you.